Okay, it's 5 past. Shall we start? Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Today, we're hosting Tony Burns within the context of the seminar series of Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice. I would like to introduce Tony. Tony is an emeritus professor of political theory in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. He was a senior research fellow in the Center of Aristotelian Studies and Critical Theory, Mykolas Romeris University, Lithuania. He is also one of the co-directors of CSSGJ. His research interests are, if I need to read, Marxism as an intellectual tradition, questions of methods in the history of political thought, concept of natural law, the Aristotelian political tradition, relationship between science and politics in the works of utopian literature, and politics of recognition in the history of political thought before and after Hegel. Tony has many publications, so I was thinking about selecting some. So I would like to read some of the books as his main contributions to literature on political theory. For instance, Natural Law and Political Ideology of Hegel, the Hegel-Marx Connection, published in 2000 from Macmillan, Political Theory, Science Fiction, and Utopian Literature, Ursula Le Guin and the Dispossessed, published in 2008. And I finally would like to refer to this trilogy. The first 2 volumes are already published. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Tony. In 2020, Social Institutions and the Politics of Recognition, From the Ancient Greeks to Reformation, published as first volume in 2020, and the second volume named as Social Institutions and the Politics of Recognition, From the Reformation to the French Revolution. And I think you're in the process of writing the third, please correct me again if I'm wrong, named as Masters and Slaves, Social Institutions and the Politics of Recognition from Hegel to the Present, to be published.
Somebody needs to mute their mic, I think.
To be published from Manchester University Press. So Tony is going to speak about Orthodox Marxism and its criticisms today, which I'm sure will be very thought-provoking, especially for people who are interested in Marxism as a tradition and political theory in general. As usual, we will have 40 minutes for Tony's presentation that will be followed with 40 minutes of questions and answers. For method, I think it's better if you prefer to turn on your camera and we have an engagement. But if you prefer to write in the chat box, I'll be more than happy to read it to Tony. Tony, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Elif. So, how do I move? Oh, okay, that's not helpful. I'm trying to move my screen on and it's not doing anything.
Yeah, we can see the first page.
Mine isn't moving. That's not help. Right. Does anybody have any advice?
Tony, perhaps if you just
similar patterns in a psychodynamic.
I'll stop sharing and then and start it again, and hopefully that will sort it out.
Okay, now we cannot see. I think you stopped it. Yeah, we can see it now, the first page.
Right. Ah, there we are.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Perfect.
A moment's panic there. Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Ellie. So I've got a structure. I think there's probably too much here for 40 minutes, so I think I'm going to truncate it. I had 15 minutes at the Historical Materialism Conference last week, and it took me 15 minutes to talk about the fourth of the 4 points there, Orthodox Marxism History. So I think what I'll do is, there are really two papers there, 1, 2, and 3, or 1, 2, and 4. And I'll go for 1, 2, and 4, and just very briefly mention 3 today. So let's start with just a few remarks about questions of method. So this section has nothing to do with Marxism, actually. It's just about intellectual history and intellectual traditions. Of course, later on, I'm going to talk about Marxism as an intellectual tradition, but let's just make some very general remarks first about intellectual traditions. What is an intellectual tradition? Well, we're talking, of course, about a framework of ideas or concepts. I use those two terms interchangeably, which involves change over time, conceptual innovation, either the introduction of new concepts or a change in the meaning of an existing concept. So there are a number of questions that might be thought to be of interest for people who focus on intellectual traditions. How do concepts first emerge, derive their meaning, for example? Do they have an essential meaning, an unchanging core, as it were? If it's possible for the meaning of a concept to change or an idea to change over time, then how and why does that happen? Who or what are the agents of conceptual innovation or conceptual change? And are there any limits, of course, within a particular tradition to the extent to which conceptual innovation can be permitted to take place? At what point do we actually have a new and entirely different concept? And in particular, I think we're thinking about ahead towards looking at Marxism as an intellectual tradition. How can or should we establish whether a particular thinker, X, let's call that person X, lies within or outside of a particular intellectual tradition? How do we delimit the boundaries of a particular tradition, whether that's Marxism or Aristotelianism or any intellectual tradition? And of course, that's as much a political as it is an intellectual issue, I think. It's actually a form of identity politics. I know usually Marxism isn't associated with identity politics, but we're talking about the naming or the labeling or identifying of a particular individual X, basically bringing them under a concept, some concept or other, for example, Marxism. And in any given case, whether we do that, whether we ascribe the label or withhold it, obviously depends on X, but it also depends on the meaning of the concept in question. So I'm quite interested in these issues generally. I like to apply Hegel's notion of a struggle for recognition to questions of this kind. I'm not the first person to do that. I did think of it myself, actually, but unfortunately, of course, when you do some reading, even if you think you've had a good idea, it turns out that it might be new to you, but somebody else has thought of it first. And in this case, G. Douglas Atkins did. The idea of a struggle for recognition around the meaning of concepts or words. And of course, Lewis Carroll's Humpty Dumpty and Alice Through the Looking Glass captures that very well. Words mean what I want them to mean, nothing more and nothing less, he says. And the real issue, so far as the struggle over the meaning of words or concepts is concerned, is who is to be master. That is all. I think success or failure in this struggle for recognition depends on many things, actually, of course. But in particular, one of the things it depends on, I think, is rhetoric, or the art of rhetorical persuasion. And in particular, I think it involves what something that the intellectual historian Quentin Skinner refers to as paradiastole. Basically, this has to do with the withholding or ascribing descriptive labels to something. Two people might look at what, in a sense, might be said to be the same thing, but describe it in very different, opposite ways. In one case, perhaps to approve of it, and another case to disapprove of it. That's basically rhetorical redescription or paradiastole, as Skinner understands it. A classic example, I suppose, would be the freedom fighter terrorist case, but I used the example of one person's courage is another person's recklessness there. So that'll do for intellectual traditions. And of course, none of that's got anything to do with Marxism. But of course, one can think about Marxism as an intellectual tradition. Of course, some people wouldn't like that. It's clearly also a political tradition, and we don't want to emasculate, at least sight completely the politics of all of this. But it's a relative notion, I think, to focus on Marxism as an intellectual tradition. And of course, if you do that, then there are a number of questions which arise. I'm particularly interested in the idea of whether is there just one Marxist tradition or is there more than one, and particularly this debate between what are usually referred to as Western Marxists on the one hand and so-called Orthodox Marxists on the other. And these are usually regarded as being sort of polar opposites in the sort of Hegelian sense, that what Western Marxists affirm, Orthodox Marxists deny, and vice versa. So who are we talking about? How do we identify the individuals concerned? Well, here's a selection of people who have been thought to be associated with Western Marxism, rightly or wrongly. I won't go into that. And then certainly in the case of Gramsci, that's obviously a controversial thing. And here are the people who are usually associated with Orthodox Marxism, the so-called usual suspects. When and where did this distinction between Orthodox Marxism and Western Marxism emerge? Well, I think the labels perhaps did emerge with that number of publications in the 1970s and 80s. They all have Western Marxism in the title, and Perry Anderson's book, Considerations on Western Marxism, is probably the most significant of them. But that's the phraseology or the terminology. I mean, clearly some people anyway think that we can go back further than that, and certainly in the case of Orthodox Marxism, trace the origins of Orthodox Marxism much earlier. Some people focus on the revisionism controversy at the end of the 19th century, the debate which took place between Marxists, which was engendered by the publication of Bernstein's book, The Presuppositions of Socialism and the Tasks of Social Democracy, in 1899. And certainly in Lenin's writings, I think, when he's criticizing Bernstein, you get references to Orthodox Marxism there. And of course, Bernstein's beyond the pale as far as Lenin's concerned. This is not a revision of Marxism, or it isn't Marxism at all. He's outside of the delimiting boundary of the tradition, according to Lenin. I'm interested in the fact that Engels actually explicitly uses the phrase Orthodox Marxism in his correspondence from around 1885, the last 10 years of his life. He died in 1895. And it quite explicitly refers to Orthodox Marxism before the publication of Bernstein's book. So I quite like the idea of tracing the use of the phrase, anyway, the idea back before the revisionist controversy. But it is worth pointing out, I think, that the revisionism controversy is an example of what I was talking about earlier, the politics of naming or labeling, the attaching or withdrawing of a particular label, Marxist, revisionist, and so on and so forth, to an individual person, X, whoever that might be, with a view either to praising them or to criticize them, to blame them, as it were. So I think if you're sympathetic to Bernstein, or possibly later to the ideas which are often associated with Western Marxism, you're quite likely to associate Orthodox Marxism with Stalinism. And an Orthodox Marxist view is likely to be a supporter of the policies of the Communist Party, for example, in the Soviet Union, or the Western European Communist parties, who subordinated their activities to the interests of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And I guess if you're an Orthodox Marxist, you're quite likely to use revisionist as a term of abuse. That's an example, I think, of what Skinner has in mind when he talks about paradiastoly.
Tony, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think we need to ask kindly people to unmute. If it's possible. Oh, thank you. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Right. So that's Marxism and intellectual tradition. Now, so the question of philosophy. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think this would be an extensive thing on its own. So I just want to make. I think it's odd to deliver a paper on Orthodox Marxism and not mention questions of philosophy, ontology, and epistemology, as philosophers like to refer to them. And obviously, this is an issue. I mean, one thinks of Lenin's remark in Materialism and Imperial Criticism, which he published in 1908, you know, talking about Marxist philosophy, but it's a single piece of steel, and we can't eliminate one basic premise, one essential part without departing from objective truth. This is a classic example, I think, of what I was talking about earlier, but in this case, focusing specifically on questions of philosophy. The Polish Marxist philosopher, Leszek Kolakowski, makes a very interesting comment in one of his books, in the preface to Marxism and Beyond, where he draws attention to the fact he eventually left Poland. Of course, he was given a position at Oxford. He was sort of an intellectual dissident, I think. What he refers to as Stalinist integrism, basically this is Orthodox Marxism. He points out that one of the most interesting things that he'd experienced was the fact that of all of his writings, the one that annoyed the Polish Communist Party most of all were the essays that he wrote, which dealt with purely philosophical questions, not focusing on what are obviously political issues, but on what he considered to be academic epistemological, in other words, purely philosophical issues. So we're talking about the politicization, I guess, of what some people would consider to be just questions of philosophy. So this is an interesting thing, and you could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'm not going to. Central to the debate, of course, is this idea of dialectical materialism, the official philosophy, I think, of the Russian Communist Party. This is often associated with Lenin's book, of course, but Stalin also wrote about dialectical materialism, and there's any number of books with dialectical materialism in the title. So I could spend 10 or 15 minutes just talking about this, and that's, I don't want to, because I just don't have the time. So I'm just going to draw your attention to the fact that there was a debate. Engels is usually associated, philosophically anyway, with Orthodox Marxism, and on the other side we have the criticisms of Engels's views, the dialectics of nature, starting with Lukács, I think, in History and Class Consciousness in 1923. Basically, the general thrust is to try to drive a wedge, I think, between Marx and Engels, and to suggest that somehow or other Marxism as an intellectual tradition has been corrupted by Engels, or by people who attach too much importance to Engels's philosophical views, which Marx didn't share. Basically, I think that's the bottom line. So again, that would be I'd easily spend 15-20 minutes talking about that, and we can come back to it if you want to in the discussion, but I need to move on, I think, and focus on other aspects. This is from it's actually a footnote in Lukács's book, and from the essay entitled "What is Orthodox Marxism?" and it summarizes the issues, I think, very well. You know, he says, well, yeah, the misunderstandings of Marx and Marxism, which Engels' treatment of the matter produced, because he relies too much on Hegel. Basically, the bottom line is Engels talks about the dialectics of nature. Marx didn't, or wasn't interested in philosophical issues or in that side of things at all. And so Marxism takes a wrong turn with Engels, according to Lukács. So all of that's extremely interesting, and if you want to talk about it, I'm quite happy to. But I don't think I really want to do that because I haven't got the time. So let's move on. Let's focus on our attention today on the fourth of the things that I said I wanted to talk about. So Orthodox Marxism, insofar as it applies to our understanding of history and the writing of history. So this is the bit that I did at the historical materialism conference last week, and not surprisingly, because of course we are talking about historical materialism. So let's just think, first of all, what are the ideas which are usually associated with Orthodox Marxism by people who don't like it, who are critical of it? This is the sort of Western Marxist, let's say, critique of Orthodox Marxism. So the key text, of course, the key source is the preface to Marx's A Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy, which he published in 1859, which is much cited. So it's in that very short text, which I always advise my students, you must read this, not because I agree with it, but because it's so important historically. So it's there that Marx makes this distinction. Some people call it a metaphor. It's an interesting issue whether it really is a metaphor, because metaphors are sort of, as it were, they're literary, aren't they, and don't depict reality, as it were. Basis and superstructure. It's here that Marx talks about modes of production. He differentiates between forces of production and relations of production, and in some accounts, different types of relationship of production. He suggests here that, interestingly, I think that each society at any given time contains just one mode of production, or at least on this reading of his views. So there's no concept of a social formation, which I've written about and I'm interested in this reading of Marx anyway. This reading suggests that Marx is some sort of economic determinist or technological determinist, a productive forces determinist. And it also attributes to Marx, as you see in the quote at the bottom there, not from the preface, but from the Marxist Poverty Philosophy, which he published in 1847. And this reading, anyway, also attributes to Marx a sort of linear or stages understanding of human history, beginning with, well, not beginning with slavery, actually, I think that's the second one, isn't it? But then feudalism and capitalism, and in the future, of course, socialism, and then communism. So this raises an interesting question, of course. Was Karl Marx an Orthodox Marxist in this sense? And I don't think he was. I mean, obviously, you can't deny that he wrote the preface to A Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy. But I think anybody who focused just on that text in order to elicit what his approach to history writing involves, I think would almost certainly get it wrong or overlook things which many people, not just me, think are actually quite important. Marx, towards the end of his life, took an interest in Russia, of course, as we know, and he was very interested in the issue of whether the ideas that he developed earlier on in his life actually had an application to Russia. And in 1877, he wrote to a Russian journal. I won't try to pronounce that. I don't think I could. But he was very critical of a Russian Marxist, N.K. Mikhailsky, who tried to apply Marx's theoretical principles to the particular case of history, relying on the preface to A Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy. And Marx sort of says, well, look, we don't want to take that too seriously. What this Mikhailsky character's doing is turning historical materialism into something that Marx refers to as a general historical philosophical theory, and applying it to the Russian case and completely ignoring the particularities or the individual circumstances that Russian society was confronted by in the 19th century. In other words, he was imposing theoretical categories on that without engaging in the sort of detailed empirical investigation that Marx clearly thought was so important. And if you do that, what you have is basically not history, but philosophy of history, I think, in a sort of quasi or even an actual Hegelian sense. And it's very clear, I think, from what Marx says about this case, that he doesn't think you can history. He disagrees with Hegel, of course, what he takes to be Hegel's view, that history cannot be written a priori. We do need, in any given case, detailed empirical investigation, the facts, in inverted commas, let's say. And although, of course, when we engage in an active empirical investigation, we bring with us certain assumptions which we make, informed by our past experience, nevertheless, at the same time, we always to be willing to revise those assumptions within limits anyway, depending on what our empirical investigation of the case in hand turns up. In other words, we shouldn't, as it were, dogmatically impose or prejudge, if you like, the given case with which we're confronted. And I think that captures very well the way in which Marx actually wrote history. If you think about what he wrote about the history of France in the middle of the 19th century, it's very clear that he's very sensitive to the circumstances, the peculiarities of the particular case. And the way he actually wrote history there didn't really conform to what he says in the preface to a contribution to a critique of political economy. This is captured very well, I think, by Engels, actually, of course, in this very well-known remark that he makes in his letter to Conrad Schmidt in August 1890, where he says, well, look, I remember very well Marx in the 1870s in debate with some French Marxists about his own ideas. Basically, they were sort of French version of Mikhailsky and interpreted Marx in the way that he did. And Marx, according to Engels, Marx in French, but basically his retort to that reading of his own views was, well, if that's Marxism, then I'm not a Marxist. And it's quite a striking thing for him to say. And that, of course, raises the question of Engels' own attitude towards Marxism, given the fact that he's generally thought to be an Orthodox Marxist. So that's what I'm going to turn to consider next. Now, the interesting thing about Engels is that the term Orthodox Marxism is used by Engels in his, as I said, in his correspondence from the mid-1880s onwards. But the interesting thing about Engels' use of that expression, I think the concept itself predates that, but the actual phrase Orthodox Marxism is used by Engels in his correspondence. And the interesting thing is when he talks about Orthodox Marxism in these letters, he's critical of it. He rejects it, basically. He considers Orthodox Marxism to be, he criticizes it on the same lines as Marx criticized Mikhailsky. He thinks if you're an Orthodox Marxist, then you are dogmatic, doctrinaire, sectarian. You impose philosophical categories on the historical material in front of you willy-nilly without being sensitive to the circumstances of the particular case and so on and so forth. Engels associates this attitude of mind, Orthodox Marxism in that sense, which of course he strongly disapproved of, with the Social Democratic Federation in England, H.M. Hindman and co. He says they're the Orthodox Marxists, and of course they've turned historical materials of Marxism into a rigid dogma. They've become, he says, basically a mere sect, he says in a letter to Sorg in 1891. And similarly, again, the next year, in a letter to Karl Kautsky, he says, the Social Democratic Federation, it's a sect, pure and simple. It's ossified Marxism into a hard and fast dogma. It repudiates any labor movement, he says, that isn't Orthodox Marxist. That's to say, Marxist in a very wrong-headed way. So he criticizes the Social Democratic Federation in much the same way that Marx criticized Mikhailsky, I think. In opposition to Orthodox Marxism understood in that way, Engels makes a couple of remarks. He first says, well, look, Marxism properly understood, in my opinion, is not doctrinaire or dogmatic. It's not a credo, like a catechism in the Christian religion, something to be learned by rote and then parroted out. It's a guide to action, he says. That's not that helpful. I think what he means is this. It's our view of history, says Marx and my own view of history. First and foremost, he says, it's as an intellectual approach in history, the discipline of history, it's a guide to study. So you can't change the world basically unless you understood it. And to understand it, you've got to look at it in the right way. And of course, you do bring to the table with you certain assumptions you've made on the basis of past experience and theoretical work, but you're always confronted by a particular case, for example, Russia. And so you need to be willing, he says, to study history anew. Notice the reference to social formations there, which I'm quite interested in. But whatever the society or the social formation that you're writing about and studying, it needs to be individually investigated. You can't, as it were, as Marx has said in his critique of Mikhailsky, you can't prejudge things and impose categories on the material. You need to draw the categories out of the material. In other words, I think both Marx and Engels have said, well, you need to be, in a sense anyway, willing to revise your assumptions, always within limits, of course. But he agrees with Marx. You can't write history a priori. And I think he's, despite his reputation as an Orthodox Marxist, he's very clear that Orthodox Marxism, as he understands it, is a bad thing. Okay, so I've probably about 10 minutes, perhaps less. So I think we'll probably be okay. The 7 minutes might do it, actually. Okay, let's turn to think about what Lenin has to say about Orthodox Marxism. Forget the philosophy. I'm not talking about materialism and imperial criticism. I'm talking about Lenin's attitude towards history, historical materialism. What's his attitude towards Orthodox Marxism in that field? Well, it's ambivalent, actually. Unlike Engels, he defends Orthodox Marxism, as he understands it anyway. But the thing is, the Orthodox Marxism that he defends is not, absolutely not, the Orthodox Marxism that Engels criticizes. But first, let's just record the fact that he defends it. So he does. So here's something that he wrote in 1899. He's saying opportunists of all stripes love to derive the Russian Social Democratic Party for being dogmatists and orthodox, but of course he doesn't agree with that. And in 1909, he says the Bolshevik wing of the Social Democratic Party in Russia is an organization which consciously takes its stand on the basis of Orthodox Marxism. But the fact is, Lenin doesn't actually mean by Orthodox Marxism what Engels means by it when Engels criticizes it in his correspondence. In other words, he disagrees with Engels when it comes to the question of what is Orthodox Marxism. He objects strongly to any caricature, he says, of Marxism. So he wrote a letter to a Russian journal, Proletariat. It's a reply to somebody, I don't know who this Lyadov person is, but Lyadov had written in and defending Orthodox Marxism, and Lenin says, well, that's great, thank you very much, I approve of that, I'm very glad you think that Orthodox Marxism is good, but you need to be careful. What is this thing that you think you're defending? We need to protect Bolshevism, in other words, Orthodox Marxism in Russia, from its caricature, he says. Lenin actually quotes in 1907, in the preface that he wrote to an interesting collection of letters which had been translated into Russian and published. And he quotes Engels' correspondence, where Engels criticizes the Social Democratic Federation in Britain because of its sectarianism and its dogmatism. And so the double quotes there are taken. Lenin took these phrases from Engels' letters. So he says, you know, Engels criticizes the Social Democratic Federation because of its rigid orthodoxy, and because it doesn't recognize that Marxism is a guide to action. It thinks of it as being a credo. But the thing about Lenin is that when he's talking about Orthodox Marxism, he doesn't think that all Orthodox Marxists are rigid in their approach to understanding history. He makes a very clear distinction, I think, not between two types of Marxism, but quite explicitly two ways of thinking about Orthodox Marxism, one of which is good and one of which is bad, one of which is true Orthodox Marxism and one of which is not. It's a pseudo-orthodoxy, he says, or a vulgarization of orthodoxy. Orthodox Marxism, as Lenin understands it, the thing that he defends, is nothing like the thing that Engels criticizes. And if you read what Lenin says about Orthodox Marxism as a way of thinking about history and history writing, it's very clear that he agrees with both Marx and Engels when they criticize, in Marx's case, Mayakovsky, and in Engels' case, Heinemann. So Lenin says, let us not believe that orthodoxy means taking things on trust, that it precludes critical application and further development. It permits historical problems to be obscured by abstract schemes. In other words, we can't write history a priori and so on and so forth. Orthodox Marxism, as I understand it, in other words, the true orthodoxy rather than the false one or the vulgarization of orthodoxy, is distinguished, he says, by diametrically opposite qualities. In other words, the Orthodox Marxism, as he understands it, is sensitive to empirical details, recognizes the need for detailed empirical investigation, focusing on the circumstances of the particular case, and so on and so forth. In other words, Lenin, if we compare what Lenin says about Orthodox Marxism with what Engels says about it, Lenin changes the meaning of the concept. For him, Orthodox Marxism is a good thing. Whereas for Lenin, for Engels, it's a bad one. And the qualities and characteristic features which Lenin associates with Orthodox Marxism are the very opposite of the ones that Engels does. If you want to be an Orthodox Marxist in the sense in which Lenin understands the term, then you need to be sensitive to the individual circumstances of the particular case that you're confronted with. Okay, let's conclude. Lenin basically engages in what earlier on I said was an act of rhetorical redescription. In this case, in the case of Orthodox Marxism, it's a sort of paradiastolic redefining of the concept of, and I suppose by implication, by implication it is, in a way anyway, I suppose one could say implies a criticism of Engels. I suppose one could say that. Right, conclusion. Let's just, what are two obvious things in 2 minutes? So there has been a debate, I think a politically significant debate, surrounding the meaning of the concept of Orthodox Marxism, for example, between the Western Marxist sub-tradition, if you like, or the Western Marxist tradition and the Orthodox Marxist tradition. The phrase, the term, I don't think the concept, but the phrase, the actual expression seems to have originated in Engels' correspondence when he's talking not about questions of philosophy, but about questions of history. If we focus on questions of history, I think Engels was quite emphatically, I think, a critic of Orthodox Marxism as he understood it. He rejected it. Lenin wasn't, but he redefined the concept. So although he self-identified as an Orthodox Marxist, he didn't mean by that what Engels means by in his correspondence. Neither Engels nor Lenin was an Orthodox Marxist in the sense in which that concept is understood in the Western Marxist tradition, I think. So there is an element of caricature, I think, of Orthodox Marxism within that tradition, or in the writing, the literature, which focuses on that tradition. One suspects that that's true of the other usual suspects also. I've certainly myself, I've written about this in the past, but I've read people who say, well, look, Kautsky doesn't fit the stereotypical image of what an Orthodox Marxist is supposed to think and say. Read his writings and you'll see that he doesn't. So I think there is an element of straw person thinking about the concept of Orthodox Marxism when it's being criticized by people who are associated with the Western Marxist tradition. And I know Lenin wouldn't agree with this at all, but I quite like the idea of making a distinction between Orthodox Marxism and classical Marxism. Leave the phrase Orthodox Marxism to the critics and just deny outright that anybody's an Orthodox Marxist. It just doesn't exist. It's a fiction. Believing in Orthodox Marxism is like believing in God. All the people in the past who've been regarded as Orthodox Marxists, if you read their writings, you'll see that they don't fit that stereotypical picture at all. And if we want a label to capture their views properly understood, then basically abandon Orthodox Marxism and use the expression classical Marxism. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, Tony, thank you for the thought-provoking presentation, and it was a very difficult task to summarize all in 40 minutes, the whole tradition with making distinctions and internal dialogues. So thanks a lot. We have a good amount of time, almost 42 minutes for Q&A session. So do we have someone who would like to make a comment or direct a question?
This is what happened last week as well, actually. Oh, Andy, right.
Yeah, well, I fit the description, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I got two comments. They're a bit dispersed. I mean, the first comment is that I grew up politically in the 70s, and for me, Orthodox Marxism was very much the Communist Party. And I mean, obviously, that's later than the range which you're covering here. But I mean, I think politically, for a lot of people, that would be true of a certain age, maybe. But for most of the sort of mid-20th century, at least. I actually wanted really to comment on your discussion of Lenin, which I found intriguing, and it's very complementary, I have to say, to what I was talking about last week, which was the impact of Volume 2 of Capital on the subsequent generation. And I think the context is fairly important. I mean, when Lenin used the term Orthodox Marxism in the sources that which you're citing, he's talking about legal Marxism in the Russian context, which was basically arguing that capitalism would develop in a fairly unproblematic way. And I mean, there was a polar sort of position against the Orthodox Marxists, which were the populists. And so the thing that the sort of the correspondence in the 1870s from Marx and Engels to the Russian sort of intelligentsia, there's a very long arc from there all the way through to the later stuff, which is that will capitalism develop in Russia, and what impact will it have, and what does it mean for strategy? So it wasn't only historical. I mean, of course, it was a lot of political economy in there as well, I have to say. And they were arguing about, as it happens, Volume 2, Part 3, Departments of Production was the content of that debate. It actually was, right? So what I'm trying to say is that there was an awful lot of continuity between Engels and Lenin, especially on Russia, actually, in the 1890s after Marx died. So I just think the sort of like the debate had moved on because capitalism had started to develop in Russia in the interim. So it's a comment. It's a contextual point. So if there was a unifying question to my two comments, really, it is, doesn't it an awful lot depend on context?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Andy. I get it would be quite interesting, wouldn't it, to if you look at the debate between the sort of Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, and sort of connect that to what I've been talking about. I seem to remember one of the things that Lenin wrote. He associates Menshevism with Orthodox Marxism, but in the bad sense, so sort of in the sense in which Engels criticizes it. Yes, so the legal Marxism populism thing, yeah, I can't really connect that, I'm afraid, to what I've been talking about. But obviously, there were some people in Russia at the time who did sort of buy into this sort of linear stages. You know, if you're a Marxist, then Russia must go through this stage of capitalist development, and that's Marxism. If you don't believe that, you're not a Marxist. You know, clearly Lenin didn't like that. You know, he thought that was too abstract and schematic, and so in that sense, he practiced what he preached. I think he did, you know, absolutely. I think, and denied. See, the interesting thing, he wants to hang on to the phrase, doesn't he? It's important to him to. So he wouldn't like my suggestion. Let the opponents have the phrase, and we'll come up with a different. You know, he thinks it's worth hanging on to. You know, we need to challenge people who try to. Impose their understanding of what Orthodox Marxism, not Marxism, but Orthodox Marxism is. You know, there's a politics to that. It's not purely a conceptual issue. It's clearly an important political issue for him as well, I think. Yeah.
Okay, we have Richard. Over to you, please.
Hi, thanks, Tony. Fits really well with the discussions I've been having this weekend with my niece, who's in a sect or a tendency or a trend. I'm not quite sure what it would be. I wonder, is there any great need or danger in not understanding the three words sect, tendency, and trend that appeared in your slides? And then another question is, and is there any value in trying to unpick it, or is it just verbs? You know, it's sort of not really worth the detail. And then the other question, I suppose, slightly flippantly, is what, if anything, do you identify as? Are you an Orthodox Marxist of a classical?
Right. Oh dear. Right. Okay. So on the first point, perhaps of the three words you mentioned, I think possibly in some ways the one that sort of leaps off the page, so far as Engels is concerned, is the word sect, because clearly that's a reference, I think, to the history of Christianity. And Engels, of course, was very interested in Christianity as a belief system. I think, well, as an ideology. I think, you know, he wrote about the peasant wars in Germany, and he was very interested, I think, in the different interpretations of the Christian religion, which are offered, of course, by Protestants and various sects within, not just within Christianity in Germany, but within the Protestant version of Christianity in Germany. Some of whom, of course, had some extremely interesting communistic tendencies, I think, that Engels quite liked. And Kautsky, of course, I think one of the slides I put up there, it was a letter that Engels wrote to Kautsky, and Kautsky also had an interest in Christianity and the Christian religion. So I think Engels, when he talks about sectarianism, I think he is thinking of people who are thinking about Marxism and the way in which in the past people have thought about Christianity, and that sectarianism is within Marxism is very similar to sectarianism as you find it in the history of Christianity, and it is dogmatic. And of course, in the history of Christianity, members of one sect are quite happy to burn at the stake members of the other. And it's quite interesting. I think that Engels said there's an issue about whether Engels practiced what he preached, of course, because he's often thought to be an authoritarian thinker and a dogmatist, and not at all liberal-minded or tolerant of people who disagree with him, and sort of stuff like. But certainly, that aside, if you look at what he actually says about sectarianism, it's clear that he's opposed, claims to be anyway, to dogmatism and doctrinaire thinking and sectarianism. And he clearly does, I think, valorize, as they say, attitudes of mind which other people might possibly in a different context consider to be liberal, tolerant of divergent points of view, and so on and so forth. Now, the second point about, well, where do I stand? Well, this is interesting. I've always... So am I an intellectual historian who's interested in Marxism, or am I a Marxist who's interested in intellectual history? Well, I don't think both. Since I was a student many years ago, I've always, people ask me, I always say I am a Marxist. I mean, I'm a very peculiar kind. I think I'm a sort of libertarian. I'm very interested in anarchism and the interface between Marxism and anarchism. So I do self-identify as a Marxist, I think, but I am a libertarian Marxist. So I don't really like dogmatism, intolerance, the idea of shooting somebody because they don't agree with me about the interpretation of the dialectics of nature. I don't approve of that at all. I think so. Of course, some people think I'm a liberal, not a real one. So they were these kind of arguments that apply to me as they've been applied to other people in the past. So I'm conscious of that. But that's okay. Okay.
Okay. We have Mike. You also wrote in the chat box, but I think you're okay to ask yourself if you prefer.
Sure, thank you. So in the chat, I asked something about the meaning of revisionism in a Marxist sense, and if it's a truly useful term. But another thing I want to ask about is the relationship, or maybe the tension between the term revisionism as it's used and the advancement of the dialectic. It seems like there may be a tension between those two terms, or maybe even a contradiction in more of a conventional sense. Like if there is a solid orthodoxy that you have to abide by for all time and in all situations, it seems like that leaves no room for the advancement of the dialectic, unless revisionism means something different than that with regard to orthodoxy. Can you talk us through those two terms a little bit?
Well, yeah, I can have a go. So on the first one, of course, Bernstein's book, he actually says very little, if anything, actually, about questions of philosophy. I mean, the only time as far as I know, that he talks about questions of philosophy, he tends to be interested in moral ethics, and he's a sort of a Kantian thinker, and the Russian Marxist Plekhanov criticizes him for that. His book is actually, of course, about the fortunes of the German Social Democratic Party, and the fact that they were so successful in the Reichstag elections at the end of the 19th century, once the laws outlawing socialism were repealed. And he's very clear, he thought, rightly or wrongly, and presumably sincerely, that the party, which was committed officially to Marxism as a theoretical framework, was doing so well at in the polls that we could actually, it would be possible to achieve a revolutionary transformation of German society without violence. And so that's the issue of his book. Basically, Marxism's out of date, he says. So if we look at the circumstances confronted by German society today, all this talk about this rhetoric about the need for a violent revolution, it's getting in the way. I mean, it's putting people off. If we abandon all that, we could get more people, and we actually get, we could achieve parliamentary socialism. That's basically what Bernstein's book is about. And that's what Lenin's criticizes, or not just Lenin, of course, Rosa Luxemburg, quite any number of people who self-identified as Orthodox Marxists at the time thought, well, this is presented to us by Bernstein as a necessary revision of Marxism, taking into account the circumstances of the particular case, Germany at the end of the 19th century. And for them, for the critics, that was going a step too far. Both Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin said this isn't Marxism at all. This is somebody who clearly isn't a Marxist, who's abandoned some of the core assumptions of Marxism, which they consider to be integral, essential for Marxism as a theoretical framework. Now, the second thing, I'm not sure, perhaps I need to ask you again to clarify what you had in mind. But I guess you're talking about questions of philosophy there. You talk about contradictions in the sort of conventional sense, so of course philosophers tend to think that dialectics is, there's no such thing as dialectical logic, there's just logic, and that's Aristotelian logic. And if you're a follower of Aristotle and Aristotelian logic, then of course you don't think contradictions are a good thing. On the contrary, you think the worst thing you can do in an argument is contradict yourself. And so people who think along those lines get very frustrated by other people who think that dialectics is a strength and not a weakness, and that you need to be willing to embrace contradictions if you're going to understand the world around you, because the world basically is a very contradictory place, which I think is what Hegel thought, and I suspect both Marx and Engels were quite sympathetic to that way of thinking as well. Can you be a dialectical thinker and embrace the idea that there are some things which can't change and don't change and would never change? In other words, sort of objective truth in a sort of quasi-Platonic sense. Well, that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure what the answer to it is. I mean, because some people associate dialectics, and I think Marx does actually, in the afterwards of the second German edition of Capital Volume 1. He talks in a way about dialectics as it's sort of a Heraclitean flux. All things are changing all the time. You can't step in the same river twice, and that's why Marxism's a revolutionary doctrine, because it embraces change in that sense and refuses to allow for the possibility that all things will change. But I guess if you took that view to an extreme, you would have to argue, wouldn't you, that within the intellectual tradition that is Marxism, there is nothing that's sacred, nothing that's sacrosanct. All things are open to change. So the suggestion seems to be it's possible in principle for at some point in the future for people to just abandon completely the notion, say, for example, of the base superstructure metaphor or the concept of a mode of production, and yet with justification continue to claim that they're authentically Marxist, because these things are now out of date, and Marxism in the present, as it were, needs to adjust and adapt to changed circumstances and so on and so forth. And I must say, I've got problems with that. Personally, I don't know if I can defend it, but I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that one needs to be adaptable and, of course, think about the circumstances of your own society and time if you're a Marxist. But I suspect there are some things that you just can't let go and continue to claim to be a Marxist. That seems to me yeah, I think perhaps some things are sacred, actually, in that a Christian term, of course, or a theological one. So I'm not sure that helps. I feel free to come back at me.
Yeah, for you personally, is there anything that you have your eye on in the present day where you would like to advance the dialectic, or do you not even really think of it in those terms?
I don't really think of it in those terms. I'm not quite sure what you mean when you talk about advancing the dialectic. I mean, dialectics is a way of thinking about the world. So either you think dialectically or you don't. I'm not sure how you can advance. That's perhaps what I didn't understand when you first raised the point, actually. Advancing the dialectic, what does it mean?
Well, whatever Marxist theory has to say about like the practical application of the I don't think it's just confined to like a philosophical way of thinking. I'm pretty sure it has something to do with identifying points. I can't remember all the terms, but you probably know the terms like conflict synthesis. There's another word. I don't remember it exactly, but I want to say there's some real world application where people try to advance the dialectic in terms of advancing material conditions or something along those lines.
Well, okay, I think I understand what you're saying. So to think dialectically is not just to, as it were, talk about questions of philosophy. I mean, clearly Marx did think, I think he thought, one should think dialectically about the world around you. So these are not just philosophical categories. They do actually have an application, a real world application. It will help you to understand what's going on in your society and time in the world around you. And so in that sense, I think he probably certainly did think that thinking dialectically has a practical application. And if you take that view today, if I were to take that view today, then I would also think that thinking dialectically isn't just taking an interest in philosophical questions for their own sake. It helps you to understand better the world around you. If that's what you mean by advancing the dialectic, then I'm fine with that. If that's what you mean, I'm not. Yeah.
Is there any particular area where you personally like want to or try to apply that sort of thing?
No. My interests are more historical and conceptual, I think, rather than, I'm not really somebody who engages in the kind of empirical investigation that Marx thought was so important. And it's not that I don't think it's important. I think it is important. It's good that some people do it, and lots of people do it. But I don't do it. My interests lie elsewhere. I'm not saying that's good. It's just the way things are. I think sort of it's just a peculiarity of my character. I think perhaps I should apologize for it, but there we are. I don't know. Okay.
Okay, perhaps it's a good time now to read some of the messages on the chat. Tony, perhaps you're not saying it. Kelly Harrison wrote, glad loads of references to Greek words and philosophy due to origins and studying can say a lot on that subject. Then Gabriela wrote, many thanks for the talk. Tony, really interesting. Sorry, I have to leave. And Richard, principles, truth, piety, justice, etc. McGilchrist is interesting in this area, I think. Mike. Okay.
Perhaps we can make a comment about the first thing that you mentioned there, Marx and Greek philosophy.
On philosophy due to origins and studying can say a lot on that subject.
Well, so interestingly, I mean, course, it's on his gravestone, isn't it, in Highgate Cemetery? You know, hitherto philosophers have merely interpreted the world. You know, the point, however, is to change it. So this is one of the issues in that debate between Lukács and Engels, as Lukács understands Engels anyway. So I think Lukács would argue that Marx wasn't, the mature Marx wasn't a philosopher at all. He was a scientist, so he engaged in the kind of empirical theoretical research which he considered to be scientific, which you can't change the world unless you understand it. And in order to understand it, according to Lukács, Marx believed that philosophy won't help you. Only science will do. So forget philosophy and be a scientist. And it's Engels who's interested in questions of philosophy, not the mature Marx. And that might be true, or there might be something in it, let's say. But certainly the young Marx, again, his doctoral dissertation was on ancient Greek philosophy. It was about the respective philosophical systems of Democritus and Epicurus. So the very young Marx, I think in 1839, certainly was interested in questions of philosophy. And he was particularly interested in Aristotle, actually. I read somewhere, I've forgotten where, but the thing that I read said that Marx toyed, I don't know where the information came from, toyed with the idea of translating Aristotle's treatise on psychology, on the soul, De Anima, into German. And there are numerous references, of course, to Aristotle in even Volume 1 of Capital. You know, he was particularly interested in the Aristotle's economic thought in the Nicomachean Ethics. He thought very highly of Aristotle. He clearly thought he was a genius, and speaks very respectfully of Aristotle whenever he refers to him. That's all I can say about Marx and philosophy.
We have İpek Eren. İpek Hoca says many thanks. Very inspiring talk, especially the struggle for recognition concept. If you wanna further elaborate on that, Tony, or
so could you repeat that? Sorry.
Very inspiring talk, especially the struggle for recognition concept.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. The struggle for recognition. Okay. Actually, I think I might be able to, if I put, there we are. Yeah, I've got the chat up. So that's okay. Yeah. Well, of course, this is Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. The master-slave dialectic, of course, which some people think that is the sort of motor of history, not class conflict, but the struggle between not masters and slaves. Actually, there are different readings of Hegel, but the struggles between two people, one of whom wants to be the master and the other one wants to avoid being the slave. So it isn't between masters and slaves. On one reading of Hegel, anyway, masters and slaves come into the world after the struggle's finished. It's not between masters and slaves, but there are other readings, of course, and certainly I'm quite interested in the idea of thinking about class conflict as Marx understood it, by connecting his understanding of what's involved in class struggle to Hegel's notion of mastery and slavery. And if you do that, then in the end, what you end up saying, I think, is that there's more to Marx's understanding of class conflict or class struggle than the struggle for a more equitable distribution of economic resources. So in other words, there's more to Marx's critique of capitalism than the theory of exploitation that he develops in Volume 1 of Capital. Marx is extremely interested in what other people consider to be identity politics, but which, of course, if you're a Hegelian thinker, you think have to do with the struggle for recognition. So he's very conscious of the fact that in 19th century England and capitalist society, workers, the proletariat, as he understood it, were not only economically exploited; they were treated in a way that by their employers in much the same way as masters treat the slaves. So the treatment that they receive from their employers didn't accord to them the dignity and respect which Marx thought all human beings are entitled to. And so the struggle of to get rid of capitalism, of course, involves getting rid of economic exploitation as he understood it, but it also involves other things. And Hegel points the way, I think, to if you're that side of things. If you're interested in Marx's views on that side of things, which are often overlooked, then I think you do need to be familiar with Hegel's theory of recognition, I think, in the phenomenology of spirit. Now, that's all to do with people and how people treat one another. It doesn't really focus on texts, but that quote that I put up on the slide there from Douglas Atkins is interesting, because he says, well, look, people who write books, the authors of texts, and people who read books, the readers of those texts, might also be thought about in terms of the notion of a struggle for recognition. So we're interested in this, how do we establish the meaning of a text? And of course, texts contain words, concepts. So, how do we establish the meaning of words and concepts which we find within a text? And should we defer to the author? Is that simply a matter of establishing what the concepts in question meant for the person who wrote them, who wrote the text? Is that our task as a reader? Or alternatively, as a reader, can we, as it were, interpret the text in the light of our own assumptions and our own interests and set aside the concerns of the author? So there's a sort of struggle for recognition between the author and the reader of a text over the issue of how the text is to be interpreted and understood. Now, Hegel doesn't actually talk about that in the Phenomenology of Spirit, of course, but it's not that difficult to apply what he says about the struggle for recognition in the Phenomenology of Spirit to that particular issue. And Douglas Atkins has done that. And I just think that's a very interesting way of thinking about questions of hermeneutic interpretation. But that taps into a whole literature around hermeneutics, post-structuralism, the death of the author, for example, or Hans-Georg Gadamer, and how he interprets his views on the interpretation of text. So there's a vast literature on that issue that I'm actually interested in. So and all of those issues, because of course, when Marx wrote Capital, he was writing a text. So one of the things we're interested in is how we interpret and understand the text and the concepts it contains. So there are very general theoretical issues about the interpretation of text, which clearly do have an application to Marx's writings. And I just think if you're interested in Marx and Marxism, it's good to be familiar with that literature, those debates. They shed a knowledge of and interest in those debates does shed new light, I think, on the interpretation of Marx's own texts.
Thank you, Tony. That's it was your interpretation and Atkins' interpretation of the concept that really interested me, and it's been very inspiring because I'm dealing with some conceptual contestations between some rival approaches and also different streaks of thought within the same area. So it was very inspiring to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we have 12 minutes, Richard, but first Andreas, yes, I think is gonna ask a question. Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tony, for the excellent presentation. In the Q&A, you said that there would be some concepts which we would have to hold on to in order to retain appropriately the label that it is still a Marxist approach. So how do we identify these concepts? Is your work, political theory work, and looking at debates over concepts between different authors, is that one way of doing it? Or how do we establish which concepts?
Well, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. So this is a prejudice of mine, I think. I'm not sure I can actually defend it. But but I'd raise an eyebrow, I think, if somebody said, well, we can be a Marxist and not attach importance to economics or political economy, or you know, that's redundant. You know, we can actually have a Marxism of the present, which is which leaves that behind, and or the idea that politics has to do with class conflict. You know, this is not. It just seems to me to be a strange thing to suggest that everything's up for grabs and there's nothing which is sacrosanct or sacred. I'm not sure I can actually defend it, but that's just my gut feeling. I think I just think, you know, there are you know, there's sort of quite what those things are. You know, whether Lenin was right to say when Bernstein says we can actually achieve a socialist transformation without the need for revolutionary violence. Well, perhaps Lenin was right when he said that you know, in the first decade of the 20th century, but possibly one could plausibly make that claim today, because of course history has moved on, hasn't it? And so I'd be more sympathetic to that kind of argument today, I think, than Lenin was, you know, just after 1899, I think.
Okay, Richard, please, over to you.
Thanks. I think I want to come back to the philosophy stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Just because, I mean, you talked about Epicurus and Democritus and Marx's reinterpretation of him. But before that, you mentioned Heraclitus, and I'd never really heard of Marx as being involved with Heraclitus. And then it comes back to my obsession with McGilchrist, which maybe doesn't, you know, doesn't, because his fanboy is Heraclitus. I think that McGilchrist's position, his epistemology, his ontology, his methodology, which he also sees as very scientific. He's avowedly non-Marxist. I see it as being parallel to a different presentation of sort of what I understand as sort of Marx's dialectical approach. And then you come back to other words like, you know, recognition, and the way you just described it with the master and slave and Hegel and phenomenology of the spirit. And then you think of McGilchrist, the word entanglement, and again, it's like this: how do you separate the perceiver and the thing perceived, and which comes first, and all that sort of stuff. So I just what were you? I missed what you said about Heraclitus, but it just like set off a bell for me in terms of.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So of course he's a pre-Socratic philosopher. So he lived in the, well, I think the 6th century BCE. So the way this is often presented is a sort of another pre-Socratic philosopher, Parmenides, like Plato, thinks that essential reality, those things which are truly real, don't change, can't change, you know, like Plato's forms. So a belief that things change or real things change is an illusion, or you're relying on the misleading evidence of your senses there. And if you think about it, apply your reason, as it were, your faculty of reason, you'll see that actually nothing in the world ever changes. You know, sort of. So that's Platonism and Parmenides. And Heraclitus is usually thought to be sort of the diametrically opposed to that way of thinking. So you can't step in the same river twice, you know, Pantara Rei, you know, all things flow, because the waters are ever going over you. So all things are changing all of the time. There's nothing ever remains stable and unchanging. And some people attribute that view to Marx. There is actually a book by Howard Williams. I've forgotten the title. Hegel, Marx, and the Heraclitus is dialectic, something along those lines. Howard Williams, who discusses that. Marx actually, he does speak at times anyway in a way which is sort of quasi-Heraclitean. I mentioned the the afterwards, the second German edition of Capital Volume 1, and he comes quite close to the. He actually. So he quotes that it's the Roman writer Lucretius, de rerum natura, in fact, not Heraclitus, but again, there's nothing constant but change itself, immortal death, mors immortalis, he says, a sort of and that's the sort of in the spirit of Heraclitus, I think, and some people do attribute that way of thinking to Marx. And he says in the afterword, actually, this is what makes dialectical thinking revolutionary, because of course, if all things are changing all the time and nothing is ever constant and stable, that's true of capitalist society as well. So the thinking in that way opens up the possibility of a transformation of that society at some point in the future, and that's the rational kernel within the mystical shell of Hegelian philosophy, he says in the afterword. I'm not familiar with this person, Gilchrist. You have to enlighten me on that. But you didn't mention the word scientific, so it's perhaps worth just mentioning something about that, because of course there's a heated debate in the philosophical literature about the meaning of the word science, or what's involved in being scientific, and any number of philosophers of the natural sciences in the 20th century have debated that view. And of course, Karl Popper is probably the most famous, isn't he? He doesn't think Marxism is scientific because he's not empirically falsifiable, and so on and so on and so forth. So I think Marx obviously did think of himself as being scientific, but the word in German, Wissenschaft, actually has, it doesn't necessarily have the associations that Popper associates with science and scientific explanation. I mean, quite a few of the hermeneutic philosophers, Wilhelm Dilthey, for example, and thought of himself as being scientific, but certainly he had, he quite happily argued or claimed anyway that what's rightfully considered to be scientific in the field, say biology or physics or chemistry, doesn't necessarily have an application to the understanding of history or society or people or literary texts. You can still be scientific, but you need to adopt different methodological principles in those fields. So it's not the case that one size fits all, and people like Popper are wrong to think that there's only one way of doing science, I think. And I suspect Marx would have been quite sympathetic to that kind of argument, actually.
Okay, we have.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go on.
We have 3 minutes left, Tony.
I can see Oliver's been chipping in. I can't.
Yeah. I'm going to read his question, and I'm going to add my question at the end.
Oh, okay.
So Kelly says, all scientists, I am one, should understand the concept of epistemology. Now I'm going to read Oliver's question. Where does determinism sit in relation to Orthodox Marxism? And because we have 2 minutes almost, and I'm out of personal curiosity, where would you situate Gramsci? Because you said he is in Western Marxism, but I think you had also a question mark there. So
yeah, okay, right. Stalin, Gramsci. Okay. Well, so this is interesting. Stalinism. So obviously, some people more or less identify Stalinism with Orthodox Marxism, and that's why they're critical of Orthodox Marxism, because they think if you're an Orthodox Marxist, then you're a Stalinist, and you defend all the things that they associate with Stalinism. In other words, dogmatism and intolerance and etc., etc. But it's fairly clear, I think, that obviously, to some extent, the view that you take about in relation to that question depends on how you understand Orthodox Marxism. So clearly, some people, I think, and I think that's true of Lenin, actually, defended Orthodox Marxism, but he wasn't defending the things which critics of Stalinism associate with Orthodox Marxism. He was defending something else. So I think that if you look at the concept of Orthodox Marxism from Lenin's point of view, there's a very, very big difference between Orthodox Marxism and Stalinism, as it's commonly understood anyway, by critics, of course. On Gramsci, well, this is interesting, isn't it? So I remember that, you know, Gramsci in the 1980s was, in this country anyway, there was a sort of intellectual craze, I think, a lot of enthusiasm. It's associated with the journal Marxism Today, which was edited by Stuart Hall, of course. And Gramsci's writings at that time were used by some people to justify the position which is usually referred to as Eurocommunism. So the sort of new way of thinking about the transition to socialism developed by some Marxists in Italy. So this led to a debate at the time about, you know, was Gramsci an Orthodox Marxist or not, and what does it mean to claim that he was or that he wasn't? So I know some people associate Gramsci with Western Marxism, obviously they do, and but I'm quite sympathetic personally to the view that Gramsci was an Orthodox Marxist. But you need to be careful about what you mean when you make that claim. So I don't think when I say Gramsci could be associated with Orthodox Marxism, I'm not talking about the Orthodox Marxism that Engels criticized. I'm talking about the Orthodox Marxism that Lenin defended, which isn't dogmatic, isn't doctrinaire, is sensitive to the circumstances of particular cases. So Gramsci is an Orthodox Marxist in that sense, in that Leninist sense. And I'm quite sympathetic to that view, personally, yeah.
Okay, I think thanks a lot, Tony. We ran out of time. Richard says, fascinating talk, Tony. I wish you'd had time to cover in detail the slide sections you skipped. Thanks very much. I think it's a good moment to end this session. Thank you very much, Tony. It was really a difficult task to give us a talk in 35-40 minutes, all this intellectual tradition. And I think it was followed by a very good thought-provoking discussion part. So thanks a lot for everyone. And thanks a lot, Tony.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.